We arrived at the new house early in the afternoon, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the front lawn. It was the perfect house, or at least it seemed to be. The Wilson family had been looking for months, and this place felt like a dream. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, the house stood tall and proud, with its dark brick exterior and wraparound porch. We couldn't believe our luck when the offer was accepted. The moment we stepped inside, there was an undeniable chill in the air, despite the warm weather outside. My wife, Sarah, noticed it too, pulling her jacket a little tighter around her shoulders. "Must be a draft," she said, forcing a smile. Timmy, our youngest, raced up the stairs, excited to pick his room. "This is it, guys. Our fresh start," I said, trying to shake off the unease. The first few hours were a blur of unpacking and settling in. The house creaked, but we dismissed it as the sound of old wood adjusting to our presence. After all, it was built over a century ago. What else could we expect? That night, however, things took a strange turn. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was Sarah, but when I rolled over, she was fast asleep beside me. The sound was faint, like someone pacing back and forth in the hallway. I sat up, listening, but the footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. The next morning, Timmy came down for breakfast, unusually quiet. His bright face seemed drawn, eyes darting to the shadows. "I didn't sleep well," he mumbled. "What's wrong, bud?" I asked, pouring his cereal. He hesitated before speaking, as if unsure whether he should tell us. "I saw someone," he whispered, almost afraid of the words. "Someone? What do you mean?" "In my room, by the closet." He stared down at his bowl, spoon clattering against the side. There was a man just standing there. My heart skipped a beat. "It was probably a shadow, Timmy. Moving into a new house can play tricks on your mind," I reassured him, though I wasn't entirely convinced myself. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every room felt colder than it should, and the house seemed to groan in protest of our presence. Timmy refused to go upstairs alone, and Sarah, well, she kept brushing it off, but I could see the unease in her eyes. The same unease that gnawed at me. That evening, as we sat in the living room, the air became oppressively still. We were watching TV when the faint sound of a door slamming echoed through the house. It wasn't a loud bang, more like the soft click of a latch being shut. "Did you hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice tight. I nodded. "Stay here. I'll check it out." Armed with nothing but a flashlight, I made my way down the dark hallway toward the back of the house. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pushing against me. The source of the sound seemed to be the basement door, which stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open, shining the flashlight down the creaking wooden stairs. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement at the bottom of the stairs. A shadow, shifting unnaturally. I froze, gripping the banister tightly. My breath caught in my throat as the darkness seemed to pulse, as though something was lurking just beyond the light's reach. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I bolted back up the stairs, my heart pounding. When I reached the living room, Sarah was standing there, her face pale. "What happened?" she demanded, but I couldn't find the words. The air around us felt heavier now, suffocating. And from somewhere deep within the house, I could have sworn I heard a voice, a faint whisper, low and menacing. That night, we locked all the doors and huddled together in bed, but none of us slept. It was only the beginning. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and creeping dread. The house, once so full of promise, now felt oppressive, as if it resented our very presence. Timmy stayed close to us, barely venturing into his room, claiming the man in the shadows was watching him. We tried to comfort him, but Sarah and I exchanged worried glances when we thought he wasn't looking. Something was wrong here. The strange noises hadn't stopped. Footsteps, creaking floorboards, and the occasional slamming door echoed through the halls. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Old house, loose floorboards, wind rattling the windows, but even my own logic started to feel thin. One night, As I lay in bed, I heard it again. The faintest whisper. It was so soft, so barely there, that I almost convinced myself I imagined it. But then it came again, my name. Mark! I sat up straight, heart pounding in my chest. Sarah stirred beside me, but I didn't wake her. The voice. It was a woman's, distant, echoing through the walls. I strained to listen, hoping I was still half dreaming. But no, the voice was clear, and it was calling my name. Mark! My breath caught as I turned toward the doorway. The hallway was dark, but I could feel it, a presence lurking just out of sight. The air grew cold, unnaturally so, and I shivered despite the blankets. Then the whisper changed, its tone darker, more insistent. Get out! I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room, each tick growing louder, sharper, as though it were marking the time left for us. The voice came again, louder this time, dripping with malice. Get out! I leapt out of bed, my skin crawling. Sarah, I whispered, shaking her awake. Wake up! She groaned, rubbing her eyes. What's going on? She mumbled, half asleep. I heard something. A voice. It's telling us to leave. Sarah sat up, her expression shifting from confusion to concern. Mark, it's late. You're probably just hearing things. I shook my head, my pulse racing. No, it was real. Someone's here, Sarah. We sat in silence for a moment, listening. The house creaked, but the voice had gone. Sarah sighed and rubbed her temples. Mark, it's just the stress. This house is old, and we're still getting used to it. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to write it off as nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in this house, something that didn't want us here. The next day, things escalated. Sarah was in the kitchen, making lunch, while Timmy played with his toys in the living room. I was in the study, trying to catch up on some work, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept drifting back to the voice I'd heard the night before. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the kitchen, followed by a scream. I rushed out to find Sarah standing by the counter, staring at the floor in shock. The kitchen cabinets had flung open on their own, sending dishes crashing to the ground. Shards of glass and ceramic littered the floor. What the heck just happened? I asked, rushing to her side. I don't know, Sarah whispered, her face pale. I was just standing here, and everything, it just flew open. I scanned the kitchen, my mind racing for an explanation. Maybe it was an earthquake? I suggested weakly, though I knew it wasn't true. Before Sarah could respond, a chilling gust of wind blew through the room, though all the windows were closed. The temperature dropped suddenly, the air thick with an unshakable sense of malice. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, we both heard it. A soft, dragging sound, slow and deliberate. It was coming from the basement. I grabbed the nearest object, a kitchen knife, and moved toward the basement door. Sarah grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. Don't, Mark. Don't go down there. But something in me, whether it was foolishness or desperation, pushed me forward. I yanked the door open, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The stairs stretched down into darkness, and that same dragging sound echoed up from below. The flashlight flickered in my hand as I descended, each step creaking under my weight. The air grew colder with every second, and that eerie, oppressive feeling returned, heavier than ever. When I reached the bottom, I shined the light across the basement floor. At first, there was nothing, just old furniture and boxes piled up. But then, the beam of light caught something in the corner. It was a figure, a woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, her hair hanging in dark, wet strands over her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if watching me through the curtain of her hair. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure remained still for what felt like an eternity, and then, without warning, she moved. She took one slow, deliberate step toward me, her bare feet scraping against the concrete floor. I turned and bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind me. Panting, I leaned against it, my heart racing. Sarah was standing in the kitchen, her eyes wide with fear. "What's down there?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't have the words to answer. All I could do was shake my head. The whisper returned, louder this time, echoing through the walls. "Get out while you still can." This time we listened. The following morning, we decided that something had to be done. Sarah was shaken, barely able to keep it together. Timmy seemed quieter than usual, clinging to his mother like a shadow, his eyes darting nervously around the house. He hadn't slept well in days, and I didn't blame him. I hadn't slept much either. As we gathered around the breakfast table, the house felt eerily still. Too still. Even the usual creaking of the floorboards had stopped, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "We need to figure out what's going on here," I said, my voice low but firm. "We can't stay in a place like this. Not after what happened in the basement." Sarah nodded, her face pale. "But where will we go? We've just moved in. We can't just pack up and leave, can we?" I glanced at Timmy, who was staring blankly at his cereal, not even touching it. We may not have a choice. The decision to stay or go weighed heavily on us, but before we could even talk about leaving, the house made the choice for us. Later that afternoon, while Sarah was out running errands, I heard Timmy scream from upstairs. My heart nearly stopped as I bolted up the stairs 2 at a time, rushing toward his bedroom. The door was wide open, and Timmy was standing in the center of the room, trembling, pointing toward the closet. "Daddy, he's here?" The man in the shadows. Timmy's voice cracked with fear, his tiny body shaking. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel it. The air was thick with tension, as if the room was holding something malevolent. I pulled Timmy into my arms, holding him tight. "It's okay, buddy, I'm here." But it wasn't okay. Not at all. I glanced toward the closet, my stomach twisting into knots. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to make the dark space inside visible. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from inside. Timmy was still trembling in my arms, his face buried against my chest. I reached out and slowly pushed the closet door open, half expecting to see the figure Timmy had described. But the closet was empty. No man, no shadow. Yet the sense of being watched persisted, prickling at the back of my neck. "Daddy, don't!" Timmy cried, clutching me tighter. "He's still here. He's watching us." A shiver ran down my spine. The room felt colder, as if the very air had turned hostile. I pulled Timmy away from the closet and out of the room, closing the door behind us. My mind raced. Was this all in his head, or was something more sinister happening? I decided to take matters into my own hands. That evening, after Timmy had finally fallen asleep, I went online to search for the history of the house. It was an old place, decades, maybe even a century old, but I had never thought to look into its past. As I dug through articles and records, something chilling surfaced. There had been a woman who lived in the house over 50 years ago, a woman named Margaret Sullivan. She had been found dead in the basement, her neck broken, body sprawled on the cold concrete floor. The authorities ruled it an accident, but the circumstances surrounding her death were mysterious. Some said she had been pushed down the stairs by her husband in a fit of rage. Others whispered that it was something far darker. I felt my heart race as I read further. The rumors were that Margaret's spirit had never left. The neighbors, those who had lived nearby for decades, claimed to hear her weeping at night, her sorrowful wails echoing through the walls. Some swore they'd seen her, dressed in white, with her hair hanging down like a veil, lingering near the basement door. My blood ran cold as I realized the woman I'd seen in the basement matched the description of Margaret Sullivan. Suddenly, the air in the study grew cold. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a presence, something behind me, watching. I slowly turned, but there was nothing there, just the stillness of the empty room. Yet I could feel it. She was there. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up, my pulse racing. I needed to tell Sarah what I had found, but just as I reached for the phone, it rang. Startled, I answered, my voice shaky. "Hello?" It was Sarah, her voice frantic on the other end. "Mark, something's wrong. I'm coming home, but something doesn't feel right." "Sarah, you need to hurry," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I found something about the house. Before I could finish, the phone crackled with static and Sarah's voice cut out. A loud, piercing noise echoed through the receiver, and I dropped the phone, my ears ringing from the sound. And then, in the silence that followed, I heard it again, the voice. The same whisper from the night before. "Get out now." The lights flickered, and a loud bang echoed through the house, like a door slamming shut. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed my keys and rushed to the door. But before I could leave, the front door swung open on its own, as if inviting me to step outside. I didn't. Something was holding me there, something unseen but powerful. That's when I saw it. Standing at the top of the stairs, barely visible in the dim light, was the figure of the woman. Margaret. She stood there, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle, her dark eyes fixed on me. She raised one hand, pointing directly at me, and then she whispered again, her voice barely audible, yet filled with malice. "Leave or suffer." My legs moved before my brain could catch up, and I bolted out the door, my heart pounding in my chest. But I knew one thing for certain: Margaret didn't want us here, and she wasn't going to let us leave without a fight. When Sarah came home later that night, I was sitting on the porch, my hands trembling as I relayed everything I had discovered. She listened in disbelief, her eyes wide with fear as I told her about Margaret Sullivan, the tragedy in the basement, and the ominous presence that had haunted us from the moment we stepped inside. "We have to leave, Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "We have to get Timmy and go." But it wasn't that simple. I could feel it in my bones. The house wouldn't let us go that easily. Whatever was here, whatever Margaret had become, it was tied to this place. And somehow, it had tied us to it too. "We'll leave tomorrow," I said, trying to sound calm. "First thing, we'll pack what we need and go." But deep down, I wasn't sure we'd make it through the night. As soon as we stepped back inside, the house seemed to close in around us, the air thick and heavy with a sinister energy. The temperature dropped once again, and every creak and groan felt amplified, like the house itself was alive and watching. Timmy was asleep, but his sleep was restless. He tossed and turned, muttering under his breath, his small face twisted in fear. I didn't want to disturb him, but something felt wrong. As I leaned down to check on him, he opened his eyes, wide, glassy, and terrified. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's in my room again." My stomach dropped. I didn't need to ask who she was. I quickly scooped him up, taking him into our room. Sarah was already pulling the blankets up to her chin, her eyes darting around the room as though expecting something or someone to appear. We all slept in the same bed that night, or at least we tried to. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening to the oppressive silence. Every small noise, every creak, every gust of wind made my heart race. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps were coming from the hallway, right outside our bedroom door. I glanced over at Sarah, who was sitting up too, her face pale as a ghost. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. And then, the door handle slowly began to turn. I jumped out of bed, moving to stand between the door and my family, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. The door creaked open just a crack, and then it stopped. From the darkness of the hallway, a cold draft blew into the room, and I felt it, a presence, watching us, looming in the shadows. "Go away," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Leave us alone." But the air only grew colder, and then, from the hallway, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, as though something or someone was standing right there, just out of sight. Sarah was trembling, clutching Timmy to her chest. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "We have to get out of here." I didn't respond. I was too focused on the door, on the heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire room. Timmy let out a terrified scream, and I rushed to the door, yanking it open. But when I looked into the hallway, there was nothing, Just darkness and silence. No sign of anyone or anything being there. But the cold remained. I could feel it, thick and suffocating, pressing in around us. I slammed the door shut and turned back to Sarah, my mind racing. We couldn't wait until morning. We had to leave now. We're going, I said, my voice firm. Get Timmy. Get the keys. We're leaving. Sarah didn't argue. She grabbed Timmy, who was sobbing quietly, and we rushed down the stairs, not daring to look back. I grabbed the car keys from the kitchen counter, but as I reached for the front door, it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was as if something was holding it shut. Sarah tried the back door, but it was the same. We were trapped. The lights flickered, and suddenly, the oppressive presence became unbearable. The house groaned, as if in pain, and then, from somewhere deep within its walls, we heard the sound of laughter. Low, cruel, and echoing through every room. And then the voice returned, Margaret's voice, echoing through the house. You cannot leave. I felt a chill race down my spine as the house seemed to come alive around us. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned, and the windows rattled as if something was trying to claw its way inside. Sarah was crying now, holding Timmy close as the temperature in the room dropped to an unbearable level. I tried the door again, but it still wouldn't move. Panic gripped me. We were trapped. And then the laughter stopped. For a moment, everything went still. Too still. The air felt thick, suffocating, and I could feel it. Margaret was here, with us watching. Get out, her voice whispered, though I knew now she had no intention of letting us go. The room grew darker, the shadows deepening, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was Margaret, her twisted form barely visible in the dim light. She stood motionless, watching us, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle. Her voice came again, cold and full of malice. You're mine now. Before I could react, the lights flickered again, and the figure was gone. But the oppressive weight of her presence remained, lingering in the air, suffocating us with its malevolence. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her and Timmy toward the living room. We need to find another way out, I said, my voice tight with panic. But deep down, I wasn't sure there was a way out. Margaret had us exactly where she wanted us, and she wasn't going to let us go without a fight. As we stumbled into the living room, the walls seemed to close in around us. The shadows grew longer, darker, and I could feel it. Margaret was everywhere. The cold, malevolent energy pulsed through the air, suffocating us. I was grasping at straws, searching for any way out. The windows? No, they wouldn't open. The back door? Useless. Every escape route seemed blocked, as if the house itself was conspiring against us. Timmy whimpered in Sarah's arms, his small body trembling. Daddy, she's coming, he cried, pointing toward the staircase. I turned to look, and there she was, Margaret, standing at the top of the stairs, her twisted figure barely illuminated by the flickering lights. Her white gown was stained, her dark hair hanging like a veil over her face. She didn't move, just stood there, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, watching us. But the worst part was her eyes. Cold, empty, filled with a deep, unrelenting hatred. She wanted us gone. She wanted us dead. We need to do something, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Mark, what do we do? I had no answers. All I knew was that Margaret's spirit had claimed this house, and now it was trying to claim us. Every second that passed felt like another step closer to doom. Then, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed, one long, haunting note that echoed through the house. My heart skipped a beat. There was no reason for that clock to be working. I had noticed when we moved in that it wasn't even connected to any power source. But now, it ticked, and with every tick, Margaret seemed to draw closer. She stepped forward, slowly descending the stairs, her bare feet making no sound on the wood. The atmosphere in the house shifted, growing darker with each of her steps. I grabbed the fireplace poker from the hearth, feeling its weight in my hand. Stay behind me, I whispered to Sarah, though I wasn't sure what good the poker would do against the spirit. But I had to protect them. I couldn't let her take us. Margaret reached the bottom of the stairs, her head still tilted, her dark eyes locked on us. She raised a hand, pointing directly at Timmy. "You belong to me," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. "No," I shouted, gripping the poker tighter. "You can't have him. Leave us alone." But Margaret only stepped closer, her form flickering like a shadow caught in the wind. The lights in the room began to dim, and the air grew impossibly cold. I could see my breath hanging in front of me, and I knew we were out of time. Suddenly, the walls around us began to shake. The floorboards groaned underfoot, and the windows rattled in their frames. The house was coming alive, responding to Margaret's fury. Books flew off the shelves, pictures crashed to the floor, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. Sarah screamed as the chandelier above us swayed violently, the crystals clinking together like wind chimes in a storm. I shielded her and Timmy with my body, desperate to keep them safe. But how do you fight something you can't touch? Something that isn't even alive? "Mark, we have to go," Sarah cried, her voice barely audible over the chaos. I nodded, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop this, a way to end whatever hold Margaret had over the house. And then, as if in a flash of clarity, I remembered something I had read earlier. Margaret's death, the mystery surrounding it. Some believed she had been murdered, pushed down the basement stairs by her husband. But there had been no justice, no closure. That was it. Margaret wasn't just haunting the house. She was seeking revenge. "I know what she wants," I said, my voice trembling. "She wants us to pay for what happened to her. She's angry because no one believed she was murdered." "But what do we do?" Sarah asked, tears streaming down her face. "How do we stop her?" "We have to make her see that we're not the enemy. We have to confront her." As insane as it sounded, it was the only plan I had. I had to face Margaret and convince her that we weren't here to harm her. Maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. I turned to face Margaret, who was now only a few feet away. Her cold, lifeless eyes bored into mine, and I swallowed the fear rising in my throat. "Margaret," I said, my voice shaking, "we know what happened to you. We know you were wronged, but we didn't do this. We're not the ones who hurt you." For a moment, everything went still. Margaret paused, her dark eyes narrowing. The house seemed to hold its breath. "You were murdered," I continued, my voice stronger now. "Your husband killed you, and no one believed you. But we believe you, Margaret. We believe you." There was a flicker in her eyes, a glimmer of something other than rage. Maybe sorrow, maybe relief. I wasn't sure. But then, just as quickly, the anger returned, and she took another step forward. "You will all die," she hissed, her voice like ice. I held up the poker, though I knew it was useless. "Please," I begged, "let us go. We can help you. We'll find a way to make things right, to give you peace. But you have to let us go." Margaret stopped, her form flickering like a flame about to go out. The air around us grew still, and for a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, she had heard me. And then, with a final, deafening crash, the windows shattered. The walls shook one last time, and Margaret screamed, a sound so full of anguish and pain that it shook me to my core. And then, she was gone. The house fell silent. The cold lifted. The oppressive energy that had suffocated us since we arrived vanished, leaving behind only an eerie stillness. I dropped the poker, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Sarah rushed to my side, clutching Timmy as she stared around the room, her breath coming in short, terrified gasps. Is it over?" she whispered. I didn't know, but one thing was clear. The spirit of Margaret Sullivan was gone. Whether she had found peace or simply retreated into the shadows, I wasn't sure. But the house no longer felt like a prison. It no longer felt haunted. The next morning, we packed our things and left. We didn't look back. Whatever history the house had, whatever secrets it held, we left them behind with Margaret. As we drove away, Timmy sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window. "Daddy," he said after a long silence, "do you think she's still there?" I didn't know how to answer. I glanced at Sarah, who gave me a small, uncertain smile. "I don't know, buddy," I said finally, "but she can't hurt us anymore. And I hoped, for all our sakes, that I was right.